Oh, how y'all doing? I'm Tom. I'm alcoholic. I'm glad somebody's glad. I don't like, speaking, but my first sponsor, told me, he said, boy, if you get through the steps and you're asked to speak, you will, and you'll have a suit and tie on to show respect for the program that saved your life. Now, he didn't know if I was going to do it or not, but that's what the guys told me, and that's the only time I've ever put on a suit. And my suit was, they didn't get it back, so I had to call my buddy Patrick. I said, man, you got to give me some, speaking clothes, because my thing ain't back from the clean 'em up place. Anyways, that's why I do this, for respect for this program. Anyways, my sobriety date is December 4th. Whenever last time December happened, I had 21 years. And however many times since then. But I'm supposed to tell you, what it was like. Oh yeah, my home group is Happy Destiny. We meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we're just starting our big book study right now. And I've got a sponsor, and I sponsor others. So that's the thing out of the way. God's going to kick in a minute, but anyways, a lot of people sit up here behind this podium and tell you they can remember their first drink or their first drunk, and I can't. I started drinking real young. It was around the house, and if you just drank a beer or some whatever was around, nothing was really said. So I can't remember my first drink or my first drunk even. But the closest I can remember of that is this memory that I've got that, there was always partying going on at the house. I mean, it's the kind of house I remember, going to school, stepping over bodies, passed out on the floor, and my heroes were the ones, they get up like that and take them a couple chug-a-lugs of some whiskey and go on about their business. Those were my heroes. I mean, that's what I thought growing up and being a man was. And so what I remember is real young. I can remember times where, I don't know why they did that. Maybe they just want to see a kid get drunk. I don't really know, but anyways, they'd pass me a bottle, and whether it was corn liquor or something from the state store or something, I'd tip it up. And I can remember sometimes, look, he drinks that thing like a man, and so I guess it made me feel a part of. But at the exact same time, I mean, I come from a household where you could have been 5 minutes later backhanded across the room, because I come from the generation where children are to be seen and not heard. And like Bill says, paddling, not riddling, And back then, we knew what sex we were. There was only two back when I was little. But, it's just a different time, And so I would be scared. I'd see the violence and stuff that happened. So when I say, he drinks that like a man, but I also learned when stuff got rough, I'd go out in the woods and hide, because it just got crazy, And I learned pretty quick that I go to the same little spot where I knocked trees over kind of like a ditch, and Mama, when sometimes it'd be a day before they realized I was gone, but she'd come find me. So I learned something that stayed with me a long time, to move around, and like my buddy Toby says, my motto in the end was travel light, move at night, but so that's the earliest really that's ever come back to me about drinking. I never got in trouble around the house for drinking. I'd tote a beating, because maybe I'd steal my old man's liquor or something like that, but I was getting beat for taking his stuff, not because I was, drinking liquor. It was more of that. Like I said, after I got sober, by the time I was 8 or 9, I was drinking on a daily basis. And before that, like I said, my household is my mama, my little brother, 2 years younger than me, my daddy, and my mama. And so I kind of would get in trouble, but didn't really pay a lot of consequences, or kind of my philosophy even early on was like, if you're going to toe the beating or whatever, you might as well do what you want, take the beating and move on. Yeah, I mean, that's, really, and as far as like legal wise, I wasn't, getting in trouble. It was, I come up in, well, I was born in El Paso, Texas, but moved here when I was like a little bitty, 2 years old and stuff. So I grew up in between Carpenter and Morrisville, kind of like out there near Apex and Cary. And so like, that's where I grew up. It was kind of the country back then. And like I said, the police from like Apex, there wasn't a whole lot of them. And they, some of those weren't the most honest policemen in the time, and through stuff my old man knew, I mean, you could kind of get away with a lot of stuff back then, where you wouldn't really get in big trouble. Then plus, being, a minor, I used that card a lot too to get out of trouble, But like, I think I made it to like a week of 7th grade and then was kicked out for the rest of the year. I don't remember sitting there at that time thinking, wow, I'd rather drink and party than have an education. It's not what went through my mind. But that's a choice I made. Alcohol was more important to me. I was leaving home on my own. Before that, I would go somewhere for a month or 2 or 3, and I could always tuck tail and come back home because Mama wasn't ever going to run me off. I mean, I knew that much. So I would, sometimes stay in an old abandoned barn or something, or over at, one of the liquor houses or something, or go out of state for a while, and then just, I could always tuck tail and come back home. And I guess, and I'm not real good at years and dates, but when I was around 15 or something, I was back at the house, and like I said, I've been caught for DUI or DWI, what they were before. I don't know what they were back then, but like I was getting those before I even had a license. I'd be like, what you gonna do, take my license, buckwheat? I mean, that's just the attitude I had, and so those little things like that, and I was not really hardcore into a lot of criminal stuff, but I was robbing stores and stuff, but not like taking the till yet. Just, getting older guys, well, we ain't got nothing to drink. Go into town and keep the car running, and I'd go in and grab a bunch of beer and come running out and hop in the car and go away. And sometimes you get away, sometimes you wouldn't, but, I never really paid any consequences for that, I was dealing, as a kid, I was dealing drugs up in like the city, like Raleigh. I was a kid, but I was in like Smiley's had a bar. It was a biker bar, and then there was his pool hall, and then there was, I don't know how you politically say it correct. They weren't strip joints. They were just topless beer joints down on Hillsborough Street. And like I was getting a cut, but I was selling drugs in all them places, and like they tell you, well, don't be drinking a beer out there, go back with the girls or something, because they pay a lot of attention, I'm in college town, and so, I mean, I thought I was an adult and grown up, and I'm doing these things, so I didn't know about like city life, I'm from out in the country, and at around 15, I had been in I guess not a major car crash or I'd be dead, but like I was in like from here down was like casted up. My whole leg was casted up and it was around my body, and so I could just, go like, the old zombies, not these new ones that go fast, but, And so why I'm telling you that is like, you could have escaped me by just a normal walk, because I couldn't, and so my little brother, was trying to took my bottle of whiskey away and was like, man, you don't need this, he's belly aching, that for all the emotional appeal it talks about in the big book. But he was like, man, this and that. And he's like, you don't need it. And he was right, probably wait 30 minutes and I'd have just passed out anyway. But, he took my bottle. And, I was like, give it back and la-di-da. And so wound up, he was scared, he was scared of me. And he got the rifle and was like, just leave it. I said, you ain't got the you-know-what to pull the trigger, you little SOB. Because he wasn't like the old man, and stuff. And like I knew he wouldn't do that. And so I said, I'm going to give my bottle back. And he wound up shooting me. And, he got me in my good foot too. It's just in the foot, But at around 15, all I cared about was finishing that bottle of whiskey. And so in my mind, real quick, I knew how I was going to get him. I knew he was weak and like a punk. So like he was going to be, horrified that he shot me. And so I knew I was hitting the foot because, it hurt, But instead of that, I grabbed my gut and acted like I was gut shot, And I kind of went down anyway. But I figured then, well, if he thinks I'm really hurt, he'll come running over there to, help me out. And just as I'm sitting here today, my intentions was when he leaned down to help me, I was going to reach up and grab him around his neck so I could get my bottle of whiskey back. And that's where I was at about 15 years old, And by the grace of God, that didn't happen. He run off through the woods to a neighbor's house and like thought he had killed me. He really did. And so this time the law's coming out there and actually the meat wagon got there first. It was before they had all the stuff. But like I'm up there, I done got the 30-30, in case that little SOB come back, I was gonna, And when, we lived down about a 1.5 mile gravel road, and there were three houses on it, and like people didn't come down there that didn't have business down there. And so when the meat wagon pulls up, I'm telling them, man, this is private property, ain't nothing here for you, you need to leave. And like they weren't gonna, and it was before the law got there, so I wasn't shooting at them, but like whenever they try to get out, I'd shoot, down in the rocks, and they wouldn't get out. And then I don't remember what it was, JD or Big Al, those were two of the police officers. One of them come and says, come on, man, this been called is a homicide, and it's a big deal. And where there's times where they know where I live, I've done that. I've run them all over town in cars, but they know where I live, and no way to really escape, but I do it. And this time, I'm shot in the foot. My day ain't going good, so I just didn't feel like running. So I was like, yeah, come on, take me to the hospital, And see, this is how my mind worked then. I was going to go to the hospital, get some free government dope, and, people come by and, bring me stuff and, I'd be fine, And now this was before all the Yankees moved down here to like Cary and all that, right before like IBM and stuff. And, like there wasn't all these hospitals everywhere, And so like from where I was at, you go to Raleigh, for the big hospital. They have one in Apex, but, anyways. So as they're taking me away, I'm just waiting for them to get up there and, dose me out, and they don't go to Raleigh. They take me over to Chapel Hill, and that's like way out the way. And so I'm wondering why are they doing that, Now, I had been in the little kid bug house, at Butner and on and off from violence and other things. But so the reason they took me to Chapel Hill is because they had it wasn't like Dix Hill, but it was, just a bug house, a locked ward up there on the 4th floor, I believe it was. And I'm telling them, wait a minute, man, you got the wrong person. It's like a bullet still in my foot, man, I'm a victim. And it's like, you need to lock my little brother up. He shot me. And I said, I know for a fact that they'll lock you up for that because they've locked my old man up for it before, and it's like, you got the wrong person. It took me to getting in my first 5th step to realize they had the right person. But anyways, so I went in there and, I didn't fight it to start with, just went in there and did, they got you on a 72-hour watch and la-di-da, and so when it come time for my trial or whatever it was after the observation, they had, and people smoked in North Carolina back then, so they had a table set up, and like the psychobabblers was up there, 3 or 4 psychobabblers and a nurse and something, and so that basically they're saying, I'm pleading my case and my family's pleading against me, turn their back on me. And the psychobabbler, now in my mind, he said this smart aleckly like, but so I just burst out, when they said, I was like, well, how long I got to be here, And he looked at me and I thought he smirked. I don't know if he did or not, making fun of me. And he said, right now you ain't even, you're underage. You ain't even got a right to appeal anything. We can do with you what we want to. And well, you can only hang a horse thief once, I was like, if you say I'm crazy, I'll show you what crazy is. And I jumped across that table. I wasn't in restraints or nothing, and grabbed one. They had a big, heavy glass ashtray, and I got that, spun it around where the corner was out, went to hitting him in the temple with that, trying to take him out, talking about, you going to show me crazy? I'll show you crazy. And like I said, this is Chapel Hill in the hospital, so I don't know where them big old Popewood-looking boys come from, but they come and drug me off. And I'm hollering this and that, and it's like, basically, I told my family we're divorced. Y'all ain't my kin. How dare you turn on me like that? And that's the only word I ever kept to my family. And they drugged me off, and like I said, I let myself out a couple days later. I mean, wasn't real hard. I mean, there was no Constantine wire or, it was just a freaking locked ward up at the Chapel Hill Hospital, and went down to the local bootleggers. But before I did that, I can remember, if y'all ain't from around there, but anyways, you get to 54 and 55, that's the intersection. That's where I bought my last half gallon of Jim Beam. But anyways, it's a long time in the future. But so I remember, thinking, I hook a right and go back towards Apex where I'm from, Apex Carpenter. But it's like it doesn't matter. I can go north, south, east, west. I got nothing to live up to. Like I would have told you, maybe I tried to be halfway good because of Obama, but I didn't, I wasn't, But now that my family turned their back on me, I had nothing to, I felt like it was me against the world, But I went down to the local bootleggers, some friends, anybody from out that way where they filled Jordan Lake up, it was, went and stayed with Ma Bell and stuff. And Otis used to make the good corn liquor. He didn't sell it up north as much as like Percy Flowers did, but it was a lot better whiskey. But anyway, so I stayed there for a while. But this was kind of traumatic, so I'm gonna get my life together. And I don't know, gonna be good. Never a thought of drinking. But when I left that place, again, like when I left school, I don't remember sitting there thinking when I'm telling my parents they're divorced, that's the nice way to say it, that y'all ain't my kin no more. That like, hey, I'd rather party and drink liquor than have a family. but that's the choice I made right then and there, Alcohol was more important to me, and I never talked to them again. And so my idea was straightening myself out was I laid up there for a little while, it was just a 22 in the foot, and so I stole a pickup truck with and a bunch of carpentry tools, and I was going down to Florida to be a carpenter man. And like I said, I had been in Raleigh and stuff like that, but I didn't know like living on the streets in a big city and stuff. So I got to Orlando, Florida, and basically started living in a flop house and working day labor. And I can still remember it was $17.50 what you get on an 8-hour ticket back then. I don't know why I remember that. And like a lot of times, and it didn't matter whose ticket you had. I mean, you just went to the local store and cashed it. I would always get Carlinsberg Black Label. It was the cheapest beer. It was like 98 or 96 cents a six-pack at like the mom and pop store. So it was probably free at the grocery store. But I mean, and I remember this was just a belligerent attitude I had. I mean, it's like these fools, I give them after I cash check, give them $1 for the six-pack, and they give me like 2 or 3 pennies back. And, half the time I take it, thump it off their forehead, or something just like, and, there were times they didn't do nothing. Other times, somebody come across, the counter with the stick or a bat or something, And like I said, I remember the first place, I didn't consider it robbing, but now in Florida, you can go in a place and drink shots of whiskey, 5 shots of whiskey, and on the way out, buy a bottle of state liquor, like Jim Beam bottle, with the cap on it, and so, I drank up all I had in my pocket, drinking shots, and when it come time to go, I seen where the liquor was and grabbed me a fifth and went to take it off down the road, just like I would have done if it was Al or JD or anybody in Apex. I'd F you, catch me if you can, you so-and-so, and take off running. Well, I just happened to come out, and there was a lady, it was a lady cop too, on the walking beat. And then, I happened to just come out at the same time, and she's hollering, stop, la, 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 they're hollering, I'm dee-dee-mowing down the road, and like, next thing I know, bam, I hear a shot, it was kind of a warning shot, because she could have hit me, but, and I stopped, and I'm like, what the heck is going on? I'm just thirsty, and they took me on in, but it's like, they didn't know who I was and stuff like that, I come from the day like, I've shot at cops and cops have shot at me, and I don't understand today. It's like, that's your job if you're a cop. If I'm running, and I don't stop, you're supposed to shoot, but on the other end of that, I was going to shoot back also, and I mean, that was just the way it was, I lived on the streets like that for a little while. Then down on Orange Blossom Trail, they have real strip joints down there. They didn't wear nothing but smiles, and you could liquor and everything in there. And I guess associates of the old man's pretty much run them joints. And I knew about anonymity from when I was a little kid, You'll never let nobody know exactly who you are or where you're from. But anyways, after a while, I let some of these people know who my old man was. And I thought in my mind that they're giving me this opportunity because of what, anyways, the association. And basically my first job with them was I had a hot weapon and was set up on a drug deal, and my job was to rob the drug dealers. And like I said, I ain't even flying their colors, so it's like, if I come back and hit a lick, good for everybody. If I don't, nobody really cares. And, I watch people die in front of me, and I watch people die beside me, And sometimes, you'd be out there and it was the same thing happening. The guys on the other end didn't really have nothing either. They were just, and so I thought because of who I was, they're giving me this big, something. They just had an idiot doing stuff for them. But, what I later did with those people was basically, I was good at finding people. Let's just call it like that. And so whether it was in-house or out-house, if somebody needed to be found, I would find them. Or if they needed to disappear, that's what I would do. And, I learned, my skills through that. Like, if somebody wanted Paige and I couldn't find him, just an example, I know Paige's old lady. And so, like, if he ain't around, I can do something real nasty to somebody that he loves. And, it's a little bit easier to find somebody then. So I learned these skills, and I survived. And all the time I'm drinking. I did drugs, I'm not a junkie that drank liquor. I'm a drunk that done some dope along the line. I mean, I shot it, ate it, everything, But I was able to put that stuff down. I couldn't put the booze down. I never even wanted to. I never took a drink until right before I got sober that I didn't want to. I never tried to give it up. It was just what I thought growing up in a man was, that's what I did. And now I'm stuck in this life. And the way my drinking would get is I would drink, and then I would get somewhere in an abandoned house, or it might be someplace that I'm paying rent on or whatever. Because I had a lot of money rolling in at times, but it might as well have been Monopoly money because, I didn't, But I'd hold up somewhere, and then I'd just drink whiskey, get it delivered, drink whiskey. And maybe if it was this place, I might find a corner over there. And, I would literally be there. And, after a while, I didn't get up to use the bathroom. I didn't eat food. And it was like drink, come to, pass out. There was no day or night. And I remember one time, it's kind of goofy why I would even care, but I remember looking out one time, and the sun was just about where the horizon was. And I was chugging on some whiskey, and I was like, okay, you got to not pass out for a couple minutes. Because I didn't know whether it was sunset or sunrise. And for some reason, right then, I wanted to know if it was a new day coming or a day in. And like, it didn't matter, but, I can remember, like, trying not to pass out. And I don't, but that's the kind of drinking I would have. And sometimes DEA would come in, or mental health type people, or, and next thing you know, I'd be in a state nut house, and eventually get back where I could put solid food in my system, and, back out there, and that was the cycle of my life, man, and I'd have told you that's what I wanted to, that's what I wanted to do. I guess, and like I said, I've been to prison not long, a couple years. It wasn't even under my real name or nothing. I never got a Social Security number till I got sober. Because back then they didn't tag them on your foot when you got born, I mean, you had to, like, if you worked, or like when you was, supposedly signed up for the draft or 18, they'd give you one, but I just never had one, I mean, when I get busted or something, I usually had different IDs or something, or I'd count Social Security numbers with my fingers and just make one up, and like, it was a little bit harder for them to, find that stuff right off the bat then, I mean, they really had to look real hard, but, that's just in prison. But, when I was in prison, it was no different than when I was out there in the world, because I was dealing with the same idiots I was dealing with out there. I just had a smaller little playground. And what I realized after a while is, I was the one that kept my own self in that prison. The alcohol had me prisoner. I can't describe it, but it was just, that's all that my life was about, really. And towards the end, I gave up hardcore crime, what I consider hardcore crime. I wasn't shooting dope or nothing. And I actually came back to North Carolina to let my mama know I was alive. And I remember walking up to the house. You know, it had been set up like that I was dead or whatever, and I let her believe that for years. But anyways, I showed up, you know, and I had hair down to here, beard down to here, not many teeth left, didn't bathe on a regular basis, and what I had was a 78 shovel head, a sawed-off shotgun, and a 44 revolver, and a couple changes of breeches. What more does a man need, you know? I mean, and I remember showing up at her door, and, you know, like I said, Mama, years later, she ain't gonna turn her back on me. Now, my old man had left a long time ago, and she's got another old man that's name is Tom. So some people think, you know, but it's not. But anyways, and, you know, I showed up at the house, and, you know, she opened the door to let me in, and I seen that whoever he was sitting over there, and I could see the look of disgust on his face, you know, like, that's that dirty SOB. You calling him a son and you're letting him back in your house. And I guess Mama said, look, that's my boy. If you don't like it, you cut off, you know. So he never said much. But, you know, he had no use for me. And Mama said, you know, it ain't like it used to be. You know, there ain't stuff going on. It's a civilian lifestyle. And I said, yeah, Mama, I ain't doing A, B, C, D, or E. All I'm doing is drinking whiskey. You know, just if the world will just give me my whiskey and leave me alone, everybody will be fine. And so half the time she stayed there and half the time she stayed at his house, you know. And so sometimes I get my days mixed up when they was coming over here or whatever. And, you know, I'd be drinking on a half gallon of Jim Beam and or nodded out or something, and she'd come in and, well, I wish you wouldn't do that, son. And I'd say, yeah, but Mama, you don't know. All I'm doing is drinking. You know, that ain't hurt nobody. And this happened one time, and I just looked up at her and said, Mama, let's quit playing this stupid game, because I ain't never given up booze. I've given up everything else, you know, and I'll never give up booze. And I'm not going to disrespect you in your house. And she was scared that she'd never see me again. And I told her, and I was actually had gone back to work because I didn't want to have to rob to drink. So I was framing houses out there in Holly Springs. When I left Holly Springs, the only thing out there was liquor houses. You know, so I'm framing houses and doing that. And, you know, I had a moment of clarity, you know, a little while later, a month or two. And this is what my moment of clarity was. Now, where I stayed at was a little trailer out there in Durham. And every morning, the guy across the pond who had a car would pick me and this guy up where we stayed in the trailer. We'd go out to work. On the way to work, we'd split a 12-pack. Well, first thing I'd do is I'd hit that little juice jar of Jim Beam. Then we just drink 4 beers apiece on the way to work. About when the roach coach come by, 10 or 11, we do her again. At lunch, do her again. At 3 o'clock, do her again. On the way home, we get another 12-pack. Now, I didn't consider that drinking during the day. I did not consider beer drinking. I mean, I just didn't, you know. And on the way back, we'd stop at 54, 55 highway because we weren't far from there. And on average every day, I get a half gallon of Jim Beam, $14.95 when I quit drinking. I can still remember that. A fifth was $7 something. Those two would get a fifth. And we'd go over to, I guess, our place. And them two would drink a little bit on the fifth, and then Chris would go home. He was more of a civilian. He had an old lady and 2 kids. Eat supper, and we'd go to work the next day. Well, soon as David would go, or the other guy I was with would go to bed, a lot of times he'd leave, you know, this much in the bottom of a fifth. You know, you're talking $2 or $3. And he always kept it in the freezer. I don't know why. But anyways, as soon as he'd go wherever I was in mine, you know, I'd polish it off. And this happened once a week, it was a regular occurrence, you know. he'd get up and all bent out of shape because I drunk his whiskey, and I'd tell him, "Well, you so-and-so, if you dumb enough to leave it, you know." And we weren't trying to take nobody out. We just fight a little bit, you know, break the furniture we got off the street, you know, but nobody was trying to take nobody out. Just, you know, busted eyes and, you know, just, so that was so normal. But this last time it happened, I had my moment of clarity. And all I can describe it as, I've never prayed, didn't believe in God. Just this overwhelming thought come over me when he started belly aching. Like this happened 100 times. And this thought hit me. This is as good as your life's ever going to be, long as you're sucking down Jim Beam. Now, I didn't know a God to pray to or nothing, but what I said to him was, I was like, and I said it real calm. I said, the best thing you can do, boy, is shut up and go to your end of the trailer, and I better not hear you effing breathe. And he never said a word, just disappeared. And I said to God, but I didn't know it was God. I said to myself, if you feel like this come daylight, you'll do something. Now, I went down the road and got some corn from an old timer over there, and I don't know, did I pass out or it just come daylight? But we come and went to work like normal, but I couldn't tell them I'm punking out. I got to quit drinking, and I walked to the guy that was kind of partners with Kenny. I said, Kenny, I'm out of here. I'm headed to Nevada. You know, it's a boom up there. I'm going to jump in on that. And he said, man, we ain't getting paid for, you know, you got money coming. I said, I don't want nothing. I just come to tell you straight to your face, I'm out. And, you know, I couldn't tell him I got to quit drinking, you know. I mean, that's weak. That's weak. And I showed up to the same people my brother run through the woods when he shot me at Carol's house. And like I said, you know, I looked like that, and I banged on the door, and, you know, she come to the door and then wasn't gonna open it. I said, it's me, Carol, I need help. First time I honestly ever asked for help in my life. I just broke down and told her, I gotta quit drinking, I gotta quit drinking, I gotta quit drinking. And and just as how God works, man, she had just a weekend before, now she fetched out babies like legal, you know, for the state. And they had some kind of thing like our CPIs do. They had some kind of health thing or whatever. And she met some people that worked at ATC. She didn't care about nothing, but, you know, she just remembered them. So she happened to remember that. She said, well, all I know is if you want help, this is what we do. And see, this is like an outer body experience. This is not me that went to her door and asked for help. This is not me when she said, let me make a phone call. I sat there and they said, you need to come in. And I said, how and when? And I hopped in her car and we went there. And whatever the interviews they did, you know, I've took hundreds of people into that same place. You know, they basically told me, we ain't got a bed, you need to be inpatient, and don't quit drinking unless you can see your family physician. Well, I ain't never seen nothing but a prison doctor or an emergency room doctor, you know. It didn't make sense to me, like the world's gonna shut down at 2:15 because I wanna quit drinking. Well, anyways, that's the only time I ever drank that I did not want to drink. Went back to Carol's house, and I wouldn't even be inside. They didn't really keep alcohol at the house, but she got it for me, and she would sit there and kind of feed me wine and beer just so I wouldn't go into the DTs until I got into ATC. And I got in, went through the spiel. I'm running out of time, I apologize, you know, and I remember this for a fact, you know. They had me in the detox unit, and like I said, I'm only coming off a half gallon and some, you know, I didn't think, you know, there's been a lot of times where I was drinking a lot more, but you know, the happy dope they was giving me there wasn't quite cutting the edge, you know, and I'm, you know, starting to come apart at the seams. And now this chick that worked there, she didn't have a bunch of letters behind her name, not that that matters. She was one of us, and she was paid to work there. And all she seen was this worthless human being sitting there that was so scared to death they was going to take me back to the bug house because that stuff they wasn't doing. She just, I know for a fact, and I checked later, she had a new baby, only a couple months old. And so that woman was supposed to go home and be with her old man and little baby. And she seen me and just stayed after her shift and just sat there with a bucket of ice and wiped me down and said, I'm not going to let them take you, son. You know, I went back to that lady later. But anyways, I had never seen any kind of love like that in my whole life. I didn't know it existed. You know, and I don't know what you call it in that, but, you know, I got put out in General Pop once I got through that, you know, and did basically what they said, whatever it was. The only thing I didn't do is they was laying out on a bunch of darn mats one time and doing yoga, and I said, hold on, man, you know, ain't no way. That's the only thing I didn't do that they asked me to do. You know, Eugene and Bobby Calk and these guys were bringing meetings to me, and so I would go out to them, you know, and I got my sponsor that way. First it was going to be Johnny Bell, and Johnny says, heck, I can't be your sponsor. You don't even know where you're going yet, you know. And they suggested I go in a halfway house, and it turned out to be the Christian Fellowship in Raleigh. Anyways, you know, I had my sponsor, you know, and not only did my sponsor take me through the steps, and it wasn't just my sponsor, it was all the people in the meetings, the old timers, the ones I hated. But I wouldn't cuss them to their face. Like, I just didn't know anything. You know, I couldn't read when I got here. I mean, literally, if you people know me, I couldn't form full sentences, you know, for a couple of months. And I'm living in a halfway house. I'm going to a meeting every day, and, you know, I'm not understanding anything that's going on, but I'm just not going to drink, you know, not going to drink, you know. And, you know, my sponsor read that book to me word by word, and he could have said it backwards or forwards, and I wouldn't have understood it either way. And, like, just opened up and said, like, okay, we have been speaking to you of serious, sometimes tragic things. You know, he'd read it and say, what does that mean, son? Like, I don't know, Joe. I don't know, man. And he was a damn Yankee from Detroit, man. But he could break that down as, they called him Texas Joe because he come from Texas last night. He could break that down in the language of the heart and explain to me what they was trying to say in those words, you know. And so I just clung on to that. And like, I get to a meeting, you know, and like, I do stuff that was maybe inappropriate or I just didn't know, you know. Now, I mean, I knew enough to go in the meeting, sit down and don't get up, you know. You could smoke in a lot back then, but like, you didn't get up in the middle of the meeting and wander around, you know. If you're going to eat a bunch of cookies, you get them all and sit down, you know. And like, when I would do stuff, you know, these old farts, and that's a respect. You know, they cut your legs off right out from under you when you start talking about stuff, you know. But the thing is, they do that, and then you'd be stuck after the meeting in the parking lot, having to be back at the halfway house at 11 o'clock. And I'd be sitting there listening to them tell them, this is why we do this, son, and I'd be wanting to, like, I hate you, old man. Don't you know I wring your neck, you know? But that's what I felt inside, but I didn't dare say that. I just would listen. And somehow, some of that stuff just pounded into me. They loved me enough. They didn't love me. They loved Alcoholics Anonymous enough that they seen somebody that really wanted this, and they were going to do anything they could do to make that happen. I mean, before I knew it, I had Joe and Charlie tapes and a cassette recorder, and I had the Big Book on tape that was just read word for word, no opinions. And like, then I learned to read. You know, I started sponsoring. I left the halfway house. Well, actually, at 6 months, I went back to Dix Hill, stone cold sober, and I made it out of that, you know. And I'm about out of time, so I mean, I've sponsored a lot of people, done a lot of stuff, and none of that really amounts to a hill of beans. I know one time, like going back to ATC, carrying meetings in there and speaking, you know, the one time, like when them guys yeah, after you do it a little while, it's like you see the same guys round and round again. You know, you might not have seen them for a year or two. And when they can walk up to me and say, "Hillbilly, you ain't took a drink since I seen you last," and I say, "Yep." Well, all that spouty words don't mean nothing. When they see you there again and know that you hadn't took a drink, that's the message, you know. And I'm going to close with this, and I apologize for being on a real drunk-a-log, but, you know, a couple years ago, you know, and I've never, you know, that was removed from me, the booze, you know. You know, the God of my understanding took that away, just like in the 10 Steps promises. It's neutral in my life. It doesn't exist. But I guess a little bit over 2 years ago, you know, and I've dealt with depression on and off. And this last time, you know, I'm sponsoring guys, I'm going to meetings, but this depression really hit me again hard, you know. And I wasn't dealing with it. You know, I've been sober long enough, you know, I can shake this, you know, I wasn't sharing that. My other sponsor died. I got a new sponsor, Jim. I wasn't opening up to anybody, you know, and I'm talking about, you've been sober long enough, you can deal with this boy yourself, you know, and I couldn't, you know. So it got real bad one night, and I just like bugged out. I got up, the old lady was over there. I was going to take her to go to Colorado to see her kids for 2 weeks, and like I said, I can't. I'm losing it. I knew, and so I called my sponsor, and I called David, one of the guys I've been sponsoring, you know, and he rode out there from Liberty, come straight to the house. Then I went checked myself back into the bug house, and you know, I stayed there about a week and conned my way out. Knew I wasn't better, you know, just. I was bugging, you know, I can, you know, and she was gone. David's like, "Don't stay by yourself. Let's get the guns out of your house, all this stuff." I told him I'd do that. So we did, and "Come, please stay with us," and Susan. So I did. A few days, she got back, a few days later, and then I got back, and that's when I tried to kill myself, you know. I mean, I did it real good. I basically bled out, and she found me, and I mean, but right before that, I tried to crawl back into the house, you know, thinking, well, and I'm not thinking it's a big deal. I'm just like, something made me want to do something. So, but I wasn't strong enough to get back. I finally got in the house and just tried to make a phone call, but I knew the phone call wasn't going. Called the meat wagon, but I was like, well, she'll be back about 4 or 5, and I rolled up in a rug and was just waiting, you know. When she come back, I said, "Don't bug out, but call the meat wagon. Just tell them there's an accident. Don't tell them the law, because law," and they screwed up. That killed, you know, another 30 minutes waiting with the law coming in first, because, you know, nowadays they don't, you know. But anyways, and so, you know, that I didn't die, you know, and I went back, and, you know, I've got some help from that, and I share that because, you know, I was in a state of mind at that time. It's like, I know I'll never drink again. But this depression, it's kicking in, and I'm not making wise choices. And in my mind, the only 2 choices for somebody like me with sobriety was either blow your brains out or drink alcohol. And I tell you this, I was not going to drink no matter what. And I think, in my screwed up mind, you know, it was like, well, I better do this because I might drink if I lose it. And, you know, after I got as normal as I was, you know, I'm talking to my sponsor. I said, "I ain't telling this to them psychobabblers, but now you figure I'm kind of in my right mind nowadays?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I still tell you I'd rather take my life than take a drink of alcohol." You know, my buddy told me, "Well, you can always come back from, you know, a drink." I can't. I cannot come back from a drink. By the grace of God, I come back with this, and I share this because if there's somebody out there that's feeling like that and you're holding that stuff in, please tell somebody. You're not bad. You're not doing something wrong. You know, you're not working the steps right. But, you know, please tell somebody, and don't try to deal with it yourself, because I tried and it was not good. But anyways, if nobody told you they love you today, I do, and thank you for listening.